Okay, welcome to the second episode and the second attempt at recording Ding and the Quiz is Done, looking at the Claimants for the Throne in 1066. I've just spent half an hour recording this, only to realise that the microphone wasn't plugged in. So let's try again. So it is the 23rd of March, and our today in history is that unfortunately this is the anniversary of the first ever recipient of an artificial heart, Barney Clark, dying 112 days after he had received his artificial heart. Also, if you hear clicking, tip-tapping in the background, Mr. Spoon is at work as well, so he's working behind me. Right, let's get started then. So exactly the same as with our last session, what you now need to do is click on the link in the description and use it to go to the Do Now quiz. It is really important that you do this. First of all, it gives me information, so I know what I need to do and what I need to include in your next quiz, but it also gives me a really good idea of who's engaging with these lessons. So, pause the video and complete the quiz. Okay, we should now be done, and now we can move on. So today we're going to be having a look at the first style of exam question that you're going to get in your Normans paper, which is this: how convincing is interpretation A about Harold Godwinson's ascension to the English throne in 1066? Now, before we tackle this question, we need to pick apart the big principles behind the question. We need to look at each of the claimants for the throne. We need to look at how we go about answering this question, and then we're going to answer it. So, the first question that we need to ask is this one: why do we obey people? And this largely comes down to this idea of power and why some people have power and some people don't. So what you need to do is pause the video, fill in the section on your sheet. You can do it as bullet points or as a spider diagram, and then we'll go through. Okay, so answers we should be looking for. First of all, it's really likely that everybody has written down respect. Now, respect on its own isn't really enough. We need to think about why people respect others, and that can come down to a variety of reasons. It might be that they have a certain image, or they present themselves in a certain way that you respect. It might be that other people respect them. It might be that people who are superior either to you or to them respect them. It might be that they have a reputation for being successful, and therefore you respect them. And it might also be that you respect certain traits of their personality, even if they aren't necessarily successful. It might also mean that you have a personal relationship with people, so it's not necessarily obeying them as much as it is doing what they ask you to do because you like them. You may also fear that person, and so you obey them because you are worried about what will happen if you don't. And finally, it might just be tradition to obey either a particular person or somebody within a particular role. You do it because you've always done it. Now, the reason why this is really important is because we get a situation in 1066 where there are multiple people who think they should be king. And a lot of that comes down to who people are willing to obey. And the reason why this situation happens is because of this event. We've got Edward the Confessor on his deathbed up here, and then on the 5th of January 1066 he died. Now, if you were to ask a Year 7 why this caused a problem, the chances are that you would get the response of, well, he didn't have a son and so there wasn't an heir. And unfortunately, it isn't quite as simple as that. It's not necessarily that there wasn't an heir, it's that it was unclear who the heir should be. A lot of this comes down to Edward the Confessor not having children, but it also comes down to the fact that, as we saw in the previous reading, he had an unfortunate habit of promising the throne to different people. So it's not that there isn't one, it's that there are multiple conflicting claims. And in the 11th century, there are 5 main ways in which somebody will attempt to prove that they have a legitimate, a well-reasoned claim to the throne. First of all, you have what's called a post-obitum or a post-obitum claim to the throne. Very simply, the existing king promises the throne to somebody else and says, when I die, you will take the throne. Now, within that, you can also have what's called a novissima verba claim. This is still a post-obitum claim, but novissima verba means last words. So it will be one of the last things that the initial king says before they die. It may also be that the person claiming the throne has popular support. In this case, it would be the Y10, a group of key earls and members of the church who advised the king and helped him run the country in England. They may also have a dynastic claim, so they may be related to the previous ruler. And finally, this isn't really an especially legitimate way of claiming the throne, but certainly a way in which some people did it. If all else fails, claimants can take the throne by force. Now, generally, claimants do not want to do this. They would much prefer having any of these reasons to make that claim more legitimate, basically because it means it's going to make that transfer of power a lot easier, and it's going to make it a lot easier for that person to hold the throne in the long term. So we need to have these in our minds, and what we are now going to do is look at each of the 4 claimants to the throne and what they based their claim on. So there we go. Right, we've got our 4 claimants: Harold Godwinson, Edgar the Atheling, Harold Hardrada, and William the Conqueror. What I'm now going to ask you to do is I want you to go read the keywords first. I then want you to go through each bit of reading, and then we're going to go through what the basis was of that particular claimant's claim to the throne. So we will read through this one. We're then going to discuss this one, and I'll write it out by hand, and then the rest of them we'll do with the answers up on the screen. So you should now pause the video, do that first bit of reading, and just fill in this box here. Okay, so you now should have read through the section about Harold Godwinson, and we're going to go through it together. Right, just let me adjust so that I can write. Okay, right. So Harold Godwinson's claim comes from 2 main sources. First of all, it comes from his power within England. By 1052, the Godwins are easily the most powerful family in England. And you can see this through a number of forces. First of all, we have the rebellion in 1052. It doesn't actually lead to war, but the fact that Edward backed down and let the Godwins back into England demonstrates the power that they have. We also have the fact that by the 1060s, 4 out of the 5 earldoms in England are led by either Harold Godwinson or his brothers, although one of them ends up being exiled. So essentially, by 1066, the Godwins are the most powerful family in England, and Harold is ruling England essentially as king by another name. Now, this isn't necessarily because Edward likes him or wants him to be king, but there's more evidence to suggest that Edward has very little other choice. So there's all of this power in England, but at the same time, Edward isn't going to be in a position where he can just say, well, I've been doing the job for a while and my family's powerful and therefore I should be king. He needs a way to ensure that his claim is as legitimate as possible, which is our second kind of thread. And there's a number of things that either Harold did or the Godwins did which demonstrate their attempt to make this claim as legitimate as possible. First of all, we have the marriage between Harold's sister Edith and Edward the Confessor. There's evidence to suggest that this wasn't a happy marriage. In fact, when the Godwins rebelled in 1052, one of the first things that Edward the Confessor did was put his wife in a nunnery. And we also have this novissima verba claim that Edward allegedly makes to Harold when he's on his deathbed. Now, I say allegedly because some historians have cast doubt on this. Several historians have emphasised the fact that when Edward died, or just before he died, and he made this novissima verba claim, the people who were present to witness this claim all had a vested interest in Harold becoming king. There was Harold himself, there was Harold's sister, Edward's wife, and there was Steigen, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had become powerful during the time of the Godwins. So all of them have a vested interest in Harold becoming king, which makes this claim a little bit suspect. So in terms of the notes that we're going to make, the first thing we're going to talk about is this idea of there being popular support, through the Y10, which are largely made up of Harold's brothers. Now, it's really important that we don't just leave it there, because it's not enough that there is support. We need to talk about why that support was important. So first of all, it's important because it's going to make it relatively easy for Harold to take the throne. He's not going to meet a huge amount of resistance within England. Not going to meet resistance in England. It also means that if Harold were challenged from another claimant, either outside England or a minor claimant within England, he can also call on that support that he's got from his brothers to defend his claim. So for Harold, with the support of the Y10, it's going to be relatively easy to transfer power over. It's also going to be possible for him to defend his claim to the throne if he needs to. So that's the importance of popular support, but again we've got that backed up with attempts to make the claim legitimate. Attempts to legitimise claim, and that's done through that weak dynastic claim, I'll say. It's not especially dynastic, but it's to do with this idea of being connected by marriage. And this relatively weak novissima verba claim. Okay, so those are the notes that you should have if you don't use your green pen to check and correct them now. Once you've corrected them, we're then going to read through our next section on Edgar the Atheling, and once you've read through it, we'll then put the answers up on the board and the teacher copy of these notes, and then you can check them. So pause the video, read through, make your notes. Okay, so what we're now going to do is have a look at the notes that we can make about Edgar the Atheling. So Edgar the Atheling arguably has the most legitimate claim to the throne. He is the closest blood relation to Edward the Confessor. He's his great nephew. And there's also evidence to suggest that a post-obitum, post-obitum claim was made by Edgar before his death. And it all revolves around this word atheling, which means it's used to signify a prince that was in line for the throne. So a lot of people use that term, essentially saying that they think he's going to be the next king. But what's really important is that there is evidence that Edward the Confessor himself referred to Edgar as Edgar the Atheling, which, even though we don't have a specific document written down that says that Edward wanted Edgar to be his heir, that may suggest a fairly strong intent. So we've got that blood relation, and we've got this evidence to suggest that Edward intended him to be the next king. So if we have a look at that up on our answers, there we go. This idea of being the most legitimate claim, we've got the closest male heir, and this idea that Edward intended him to be king. So, next up, once you've checked your answers, new page, we need to read through our notes on Harold Hardrada, the Thunderbolt of the North, and do exactly the same thing. Make notes about what was the basis of Harold Hardrada's claim to the throne. So, with Harold Hardrada, there's actually a big question about whether he even wanted the English throne. Some historians argue that he did. Other historians argue that all Harold Hardrada was doing when he invaded in 1066, which we'll look at later on, is he was trying to steal from the English coast. He saw the opportunity and he took it. We don't know which one is accurate. So these notes are going to be going off what we think his claim would have been based on if he was trying to take the English throne. So Harold Hardrada's claim mainly comes from a fairly weak, in fact very weak, post-obiter, post-obitum claim, which comes from Magnus of Norway, also the name of my first cat. I will put up a picture. Who was the previous king of Norway. Now, when Harald's uncle, Magnus of Norway, was king of Norway, Harthacnut, the king of England at the time, or at least in the struggle, had made an agreement that they would make each other their heirs. And if Harald Hardrada believed he had a post-obitum, post-obitum claim, that's what he was going to be basing it on, that a promise was made to the previous king of Norway by a royal line that was no longer in power. So that is really quite weak. It's likely that if Harald Hardrada did intend on taking the throne, he intended to do it in the same way that people like Svein Forkbeard had done it, which would be to seize it through force. So we should be able to flip over. There we go. So check your notes against these two. This weak post-obitum claim to the throne, and this idea of him basing it on his ability to take the throne through force, just like other Scandinavian kings. Okay, so our final bit of reading to do then is looking at William the Conqueror. We know the pattern by now. Read through, make your notes, and then we will check through. Okay, so William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror has a number of ways in which he can claim the throne. Mainly, we've got a dynastic connection. The two are distant cousins. That is Edward the Confessor and William of Normandy. But it's not just that they're distant cousins, it's the fact that they're related and they grew up together when Ed was in exile. So there is a really strong relationship. All of this adds to this idea that that Edward wanted William to be king, and is further strengthened by evidence that we have that Edward actually went out and said it in 1051. Now, as we've seen, Edward has also said similar things to other people, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't make this promise. We also have, in 1064, a visit that Harold Godwinson made to Normandy. Now, I'm not quite sure why he did this. Some people claim that he was specifically sent by Edward the Confessor to confirm William's claim to the throne. Others argue that he was on a fishing trip and he was kidnapped, and so he pretty much said what he needed to say to survive. But what we do know is that Harold Godwinson went to Normandy, placed his hand on a holy relic, and made a promise. Now, we don't know what that promise is, but many historians have theorised that that promise was to support William's claim to the throne. So we can use it, at least as partial evidence. So we have got some elements that make William's claim legitimate. We've got a dynastic claim, we've got a strong relationship and a post-obitum claim. We also have Harold Godwinson allegedly supporting that claim. And we also have evidence that if none of that worked, William would be willing to seize the throne by force. So let's go back to my notes and check our answers. Dynastic connection, post-obitum claim, which is arguably stronger than Harold Godwinson's Novissima Verba claim, and this willingness of William to take the throne by force. So check that your notes line up with mine. So our next step in the process is to have a look at the exam question that you would be expected to complete, or that you may be expected to complete, which is a convincing question. It will be the first question in your exam paper. It's 8 marks, 10 minutes, and it'll look like this. How convincing is interpretation A about blanks in blank? Explain your answer using interpretation A and your contextual knowledge. So the important bits of information you're given are the interpretation, which will probably be either a picture or an extract from a historian, and what you're talking about. Now, the real key sticking point for a lot of students when they do that is this question. convincing. And what's really important when you answer these questions is that you're not discussing the provenance of the source. You're not talking about who wrote it. You're not talking about when it was written. All you should be talking about is what is actually in the source, and you should be using this test. How far does the interpretation line up with my own knowledge? What do I know about this period of history? Does it match with what's being said here? So today we're just going to have a really brief introduction into this style of question. We're going to have a look at the interpretation that I've given you. We're going to pick it apart. We're going to have a look at one of my paragraphs, and then you're going to write one of your own. So let's switch to the visualizer. Bear with me. There we go. So this is the interpretation that you have on your sheets, just here. First thing you need to do is read it, funnily enough, and then we're going to start picking it apart. When Edward finally gave up the ghost in January 1066, it was Harold Godwinson, the man on the spot, who unexpectedly seized the moment. How long he had been plotting this move, we don't know. For many years, Harold had been the power behind the throne, and he seems to have decided he might as well sit on it himself and deal with the consequences. What we now need to do is pick out either words or phrases from within this interpretation which we can use to demonstrate whether it matches our own knowledge or not. So I'm going to do one as an example. I will then give you some time to do yours, and then we'll compare them to my notes. So I'm going to pick this word consequences. And to me, the word consequences implies that by becoming king, something bad's going to happen. Somebody's not going to like the fact that Harold crowned himself king. So this idea of negative effects. What I now need to do is think, okay, well, what history do I have that's actually going to support this? And some of the history I have is Harold making that trip to Normandy in 1062, when he allegedly promised he would defend William's claim to the throne. This means that when Harold was crowned, he's going to face people who are very unhappy with that decision. So what I now want you to do, similar to what I've done here, is to pick either single words or a phrase that you can use to demonstrate your own knowledge. And remember that we are specifically focusing here on Harold Godwinson becoming king. So pause the video and start annotating your source. Okay, so we're now going to have a little look at mine and see the other phrases that I highlighted. There we go. So I've picked up on 3 key phrases or words within this interpretation. First of all, I've started on this word plotting, which I think implies dishonesty, and to support that we can talk about the weak nature of Harold Godwinson's novissima verba claim to the throne, this idea of the witnesses being a little bit suspect. We can talk about Harold being the crown of the throne, the power behind the throne, there we go, with there being 4 out of the 5 earldoms of England controlled by a Godwinson, and with Harold acting as sub-regulus, and the power demonstrated by the Godwins during the rebellion in 1051-52. And as we said, this idea of consequences and this idea that William the Conqueror is likely, or was likely, to be extremely unhappy with Harold's decision to crown himself king. So those are the elements that we can talk about, and we're only going to pick 2. This is a 10-minute, 8-mark question, so you need 2 solid paragraphs. And when we've done that, we're then going to turn it into a paragraph that looks like this. Now, I've only done 1 paragraph for the moment, but in an ideal answer, you would have 2. So what I want you now to do is to read through my answer, and in the space on the bottom of the sheet, I want you to explain why it's a strong answer. Now, everybody can start off with this point that ideally there would be 2 paragraphs, but there's only 1 because it's an example. So pause the video, read through my model paragraph, write down why it's good. Okay, so let's have a look then. So as I said, first of all, in an ideal world there would be 2 paragraphs. There isn't one here because it's an example. In fact, let's move to the visualizer. Shall we? No, we won't move to the visualizer. We're just going to keep it up on here so that you can see both, and I will try and highlight as I go along. So, secondly, I've talked about the interpretation's content. I've not worried about who's written it. I've not worried about when it was written. I've just focused on the argument within the interpretation. In each paragraph, the pupil has identified the element of the interpretation they're discussing by either using an incorporated quotation or by paraphrasing the argument. So I've done that here. It refers to Harold Godwinson plotting to take over the throne of England. Now, what I mean by an incorporated quotation is I've not just said one reason why interpretation A is convincing is because plotting. That wouldn't make sense. What I've done is I've woven that word plotting into the sentence, or I could have just put the whole thing in my own words. And the point of this is to demonstrate to the examiner that I understand the argument that's being made. If I just throw individual words in there, it's unclear that I actually understand the overall line of argument. The pupil has used a logical and well-structured chain of reasoning to explain why the element of the interpretation they've chosen is either convincing or unconvincing. Essentially, that bit, let's change the colour, this chain of reasoning is all of this. My explanation about why this piece of evidence I've used here proves that I am right. And this is really where the money is in these paragraphs, because this is the bit that demonstrates that you have thought about the question and you've thought about how what you know matches up with that interpretation or doesn't. So there are facts in here, they're kind of sprinkled throughout to prove myself right where appropriate, but most of this is my own explanation and thought. Which leads me on to my next point. All of the pupil's chains of reasoning have been supported by carefully selected or appropriately concise historical evidence. So these little facts that I've used throughout to prove that I'm right. So this idea of a novissima verba claim to the throne, the lack of dynastic tie to Edward, the witnesses, and this idea of his sister being involved in the process as well. Small bits of history smattered throughout that are designed to consistently prove that what I am saying is accurate. So that's what a successful paragraph looks like. What I want you to do now is to write me one further paragraph, just one, using the notes that you've made above. Now, you can write this on Word, you can write it in your yellow book and take a picture, but whatever you do, make sure that you email it to me, or if you don't have me for history, you email it to your history teacher so that we can give you feedback. So pause the video, you should have 5 minutes writing your paragraph. Let's go. Okay, our final thing for today then. If you'd like to take this further, you've got 3 options. If you want to revise, particularly if you're finding these kind of dynastic links between different individuals quite tricky, I've included the link to a Quizlet diagram of Canute and his sons, William the Conqueror and Edward the Confessor. If you want to read a little bit further, I've included a link to a History Hit article. The article does talk about a 5th claimant to the throne that we've not discussed, who attempts to seize the throne after William the Conqueror becomes king, but still interesting reading. And there is a really short 2-minute video by English Heritage, which is really quite funny and clearly outlines the key argument between Harold Godwinson and William of Normandy. Okay. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.